Hey there. Welcome to First Look. Thanks for being here this week. So, I'm almost out of the woods with the COVID thing, which is, I gotta tell you, um, even with a mild case, the cabin fever of it was definitely no fun. Still is no fun. Um, but I'm at least feeling good and feeling okay and feeling like um, as much as myself as I can be. So that's a nice thing. But for the meantime, I wanted to just sort of do a recap of this past week, and then sort of look ahead. So what I'll be doing today is a little bit of I feel like we did first look, and I was talking about um, like kind of looking ahead and saying, oh, um, we're gonna have the here's the sermon. It's about the Moses and the burning bush, and I'm calling it Popeye theology. And then you didn't really get a chance to like hear the sermon that went with that. And then but we have the next week. The next week is here, and it's Rally Day, and we're gonna have communion this week instead of last week. And so there's all that to cover. So here's what I'm going to be doing here in this first look segment. I'm going to spend the first 25 minutes or so that I would normally do a first look for this coming week for the passage that we're going to have out of the book of Matthew. And then if you want to, you can stick around for the extra maybe 10 minutes or so while I give you an understanding of, hey, here's I was kind of mentally preparing for a sermon that never ended up really happening. So here's the exciting conclusion of that, I guess you could say. So if you want to stick around for that segment, that's fine. The other thing to know is that this evening we're having our outdoor, not really outdoor because it's too hot, so we're going to be indoor, midweek worship series. And so that's going to be this evening. And so that portion is basically what I'll be preaching on here this evening. So you can get this one way or the other or multiple times if you'd like, but that's where we're going to be headed. But for now, let's move ahead to this week. So the context for what we're going to be looking at is, again, Rally Day and communion. And that's important only because that should give you an idea of some of how I'll be approaching the passage. Because usually, of course, I like part of how I look at a text is influenced by what week it is, what's happening. And sometimes what's happening in the world is something big or political or an election or a disaster or a school shooting or something awful or something amazing or something that's never happened before or something that's big. And sometimes the context is just what's happening in the church, and so that's what I'll be looking at here this week, is looking at this passage through the lens of Rally Day, a new start, new beginning, that kind of thing, and also the looking at it from a perspective of communion. So let me start with the just the passage itself. So this is Matthew 18, and it's verses 15 through 20. So that's what we're going to be looking at here today. And this passage, I think, it's one that it's one that you're familiar with. It's not the one that if I said, hey, find a gospel passage that really speaks to the way you understand the world, the way you understand yourself, or maybe the most quintessential passage that there is. It's probably not the one that you would necessarily gravitate towards. But if you think about it, after we read it and after you get a chance to kind of mull it over, what you'll realize, I think, is that it's some of the most practical advice that you can have. Just the way, because it has to do with conflict. It has to do with how we interact with and how we solve problems with each other, which is a huge, huge deal. Because if we need a template for anything, I think it's this. And I think it's extraordinarily important, practical, wise. So again, this is Matthew 18, verses 15 through 20. And I just want to kind of give you a reminder of where we are within the context of the story, which is always important. So, so in chapter 18 of Matthew, it's Jesus is kind of going through, I guess you could say, ways of understanding ourselves as people of faith. Like, here's what you're going to face. Here's what's important. Here's how to get through life faithfully, right? So in the first couple of verses, the subheading that I have is called True Greatness. But it talks a lot about humility. Unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like a child is the greatest. So humility. And then the second grouping there is like from 6 to 9 is it talks about sin and those who might put stumbling blocks in front of other people, and how we have a kind of social contract with each other when it comes to how I encourage you in faith, how you encourage me in faith, and then how we are responsible for each other, that I'm not just responsible for myself, but that my actions or lack of actions have, an influence on the people around me, and that's an important idea. And then in this chapter, from 10 until 14, it talks about the lost sheep. Okay, and again, that's it kind of that looks at the fact that not only do I have this personal responsibility, but then that connects me not only to other people, but then it connects me to God, right? And so that while I am, trying to come to terms with my own humility and my own ways of reacting to people and to God and to my reactions to, my own sin and how what I do has an effect on other people, that, in the midst of all that, then we get this parable of the lost sheep. And so that it leads me to recognize and to understand exactly how everything is connected. That I have my own kind of personal responsibility, that we are connected to each other and that we are responsible for each other, and that God is also then responsible for me, reaching out to me, caring for me. And so that kind of communal understanding of how we exist. And then 15 through 20 kind of expands on that. It kind of is like, it's almost like saying, and let me give you an example, of how all of this would work. Because what is going to happen in these verses is that Jesus is going to connect church people and then relate it to how conflict gets worked out between people, but how the church and the witness of God is tied in with all of that. So here's how the verses go, 15 through 20. If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault where the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listening to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of the 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you, if two of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered in my name, I am there among them. That last passage, I think, that last verse, I think gets quoted probably the most. Where two or more are gathered in my name, I am there among them. Usually that means we talk about that in the context of like, hey, we don't worship, something worshipful happens anytime more than one person is gathered, right? Like that's the communal act of worship is something that only takes a few. And that's a perfectly good and fine thing to be talking about. But when we talk about it like that, we lose the context of the conflict part. This passage, I think, is assuming that, of course, that that church is not just simply like a thing that you do that's outside of your own household. That there's a sense of communal sense. Like these are the people that you are in community with, right? Living near, like sharing things among you, like that. There's a real sense of that, and so Jesus is trying to recognize the fact that that would be true. I mean, and look at, if you think about most small towns that Jesus would have known, they would have had a synagogue. And that synagogue would have been the place of worship for just the people in that town, right? And so everyone there was kind of a part of the same community, same faith, same, it's not, there's no competition. It's just everyone here is Jewish. And so we're all going to the same synagogue. We're all a part of the same faith. We're all going to Jerusalem once a year. Like there's that mentality. So of course, Jesus is talking about it from that kind of communal aspect. So nothing is separated then. The family, the friends, the community, the church people, that's all kind of in the same, you're all doing this together. So we can't separate friendship, worship, one's relationship with God, one's relationship with your neighbor. That wouldn't have made any sense in community. So this is not only, I mean, there's a good reason why, one, this is such a practical kind of way of understanding it, but two, it speaks to how integrated that kind of community living would have been. So the first part of this, if any member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. So it gives this whole structure for how conflict resolution should work. You and I hopefully can work this out. If we can't work it out, then we're going to have other people around us who can speak into it. And if that can't solve the conflict, then we have to look beyond that. Now, our world is a little different, right? The way that confidentiality works, the way that community works, the way that we understand church membership, and that's all a little bit different. So let's say two members of the session had a conflict. Hopefully those two people can work it out. And if they can't, maybe they would call someone like me, or maybe one or two other elders or whatever. And we would try to figure out how to make it work. Now, maybe we would do that if it was about parishioner A and parishioner B were neighbors and they had a conflict about their property line, but probably not, right? There's probably some things you would do in church and other things you would leave out of church. But again, those lines don't exist as much in the world that Jesus lives in. But within the church, I think that it's good for us to, if nothing else, address church related issues with this kind of loose structure in mind. Let's try to resolve this. If we can't, let's bring in more folks. And if that doesn't work, then we have to look at something broader. Because again, the assumption is that at some point this is going to affect the entire community. And that's a little bit of how actually the staff that I'm on, the colleagues that I work with, that you have put in place in your leadership. That's pretty much how it works. That the concept is that if someone has an issue, that hopefully with me, that hopefully they would be able to bring that to me. And if that doesn't work, then they have a few other people that they can go to, like a staff relations committee or other session members or whatever. But if that doesn't work, then the broader church will eventually get involved in some way, shape, or form. Maybe it's the whole session representing the congregation, to talk about the conflict or whatever. But there's a kind of, again, this sort of practical, first do this, then do this, then do this. And a lot of that really speaks to, I think, a lot of the way that being Presbyterian gets worked out. It's not just, well, we're going to go to one person, and whatever that one person says, then that'll be the way it goes. That if the two people can't work this conflict out, then we bring in a small group of witnesses who can help us to kind of get this, hopefully where it needs to be. And that's a communal kind of act. That the conflict between you and me, or me and this person, has an effect on everyone else, and the resolution then is has a great effect on everyone, not just the two people who are involved. And that's a very Presbyterian way of thinking about it, that we are bound to each other when it comes to how decisions are made, and how things just like conflict should get worked out, because it's hard for us to be objective whenever we're in it. And you see that here in this passage. And I think the reason why I like the fact that we need to read this in context, or why I think that's so important, is because you can read that last verse, for where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. That feels like a worshipful act, like a worshipful kind of, the point is worshipful. But if it comes on the heels of conflict resolution, then that speaks a lot to how we understand the nature of church. That working out our relationships is also a worshipful act, and that there's something worshipful about our communal and individual responses to each other. And that we see that in the passage. And what's interesting is, we're talking about context, is that right after this text, it talks about forgiveness. And so verses 21 and 22 say, it's Peter gives a response. He says, then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Which would have sounded like he was almost being facetious. Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times. And that's sort of that kind of brings the whole idea home. And so what you see right there in that text is how the community of faith should work. And how do I say this? I spend a lot of time thinking about why I do what I do, and sometimes you just sort of have a moment to think about your vocation, or even if I didn't think about church as a vocation, just think about the fact that like I spend my time in church doing church things, and not everyone does. And I have been kind of reading little articles recently about church attendance and the necessity of church for children and for another generation, and for just like that, those types of articles, the things that most of us probably read here and there. And talking about relevancy and talking about the reasons why some people decide that church is for them and why some people decide that it's not, there's a variety of reasons. So what keeps me kind of coming back to it? Like what am I pursuing about it, besides biblical understanding and biblical learning, and the opportunity to praise God in the ways that I feel like are faithful? What it is about the community aspect of that I find important. The more and more I try to navigate the world, the more I understand that we need as many good examples of how to live together and love each other that we can get. And the church has not always been perfect at that, for sure. But I think one of the things that we can pursue, if we choose to, is to be an example, or to try to point to, reflect what it can mean to live in the world. And not just about following Jesus, but following in the teachings of Jesus. And so we talk about unconditional love, and we talk about acceptance, and we talk about grace, and we talk about hope, and we talk about perseverance, and all of those things. But the one of the things that I see in this passage is just that is, this conflict. Maybe it's not even like, it doesn't even describe what the conflict is. This isn't like a scandal. This is just conflict. This is just, I'm upset with you and you're upset with me, and maybe we're talking about it and maybe we're not. And Jesus takes the time in the midst of all of what he's doing, miracles and the Sermon on the Mount and feeding 5,000, all those things, and kind of revolution. In the midst of that is, but if we don't do this part, if we don't resolve these things, then those are the things that will eat at us, like bacteria. That these conflicts, these little things are like viruses that that can eat away at, erode what we are trying to build. And so if we can't do this well, if we can't solve and resolve and forgive and do that, then we're never going to get to the bigger things. We're never going to get to the revolution. Because we're going to be so wrapped up in trying to just figure out how not to be upset at each other that we won't trust each other, right? Because realistically, that's what is on the table here, is that people who are in conflict lose trust with each other. And if we can't trust each other, then we can't do the next part. We can't love unconditionally. We can't bind together. We can't keep doing this. We can't grow. We can't. In a group of people that don't trust each other and aren't talking and aren't genuine and aren't empathetic to the needs of each other, that group is, you will see how, you'll see it. It'll be evident. Why would I want to join a group or be a part of a church that was like that? And so that's my first kind of take on this text is the necessity, almost the domino effect, the necessity of that, of how, what it means to be a member of a church, to be a member really of just society at large, but also what it means to be a member of a church and how that bleeds into the ways that we are in community with each other, families, neighborhoods, etc. So that's kind of where we are with that. So that's my first look at this passage. And I think that's what I wanted to make sure that I said to all of you about Matthew 18. So look at that, read it over, and tell me what you think. Now, normally, that's about where I would end. I would thank you for being here for a first look, and I will tell you to see you next time. And if you'd like, then you can actually just sort of pause and stop or move on with your day. But if you were hoping to get some sort of resolution to the first look that I did last week, and then I got COVID and couldn't do the sermon, and you're not going to be there this evening to kind of hear me flesh that out in the sermon discussion thing that we have in the worship service this evening, then let me do that for you here. So part 2 starts now. So this past week, what we did was we looked at the burning bush story of Exodus, and I'm going to get to Exodus 3 verses 1 through 15, and so first of all, you probably already, because you know the cartoon, I called it Popeye theology, and it was, I'm sure you've already guessed it. It's not that sneaky. I called it that because there's that phrase in there where God refers to God's self, like, what should I call you? Moses says, what should I call you? So that Israel, when Israel asks, who's going to be leading us out? Who's going to make this revolution happen? Who's going to, free us from Egypt? Who should I say that you are? God says, I am who I am, which is famously a phrase that Popeye uses. Popeye the Sailor Man. I am who I am. Like, I'm not going to do the accent. I'm not going to do that I got thing. But so I was thinking about that. And so I'm sure I would have started off the sermon with, that kind of declaration of looking at the character of Popeye. And to be honest, I never really found Popeye to be that compelling. It really wasn't even that good of a cartoon, at least not when I was watching it. Now I realize I'm a child of the 80s, and so by the 80s, Popeye was, a little, I don't want to say hokey, but like it's something that had been done. Like, it was for another era, and there was Bruno and there was olive oil, and they would get into little, and there was like eat your spinach and that kind of thing. And I think Robin Williams was doing a movie about Popeye. Anyway, the muscles were ridiculous and the whole thing. And so, the thing I think I took away from that, if there was any lesson to take away from that silly character, who, frankly didn't really seem that in touch with anything. Like Popeye was, seemed a little, he was a caricature on purpose, and as much of a caricature as you could be. But, I think the one, reverberating lesson was that he was trying to be the best version of himself that he knew how to be. And that the declaration of I am who I am was one that was just kind of honest and humble and non-apologetic, at the same time, and I think that resonates with a lot of people. That some of it was, I think, was a little bit like, I tell it how it is, or um, it is what it is, or at the end of the day, like those kind of phrases that we kind of say that just kind of spell something out as plain, and like, hey, you can't run away from the truth, you can't run away from who you are, um, and you have to face that and embrace that, and try to be, again, the best version of yourself that you can be, um, and pursue that consistently, and that was what I saw in that silly cartoon. It was a kind of an encouragement to kids, especially, to the whole eat your spinach thing, but which seems like such a very mid-century hilarious way of trying to sneak in vegetables into kids' lives. But just, I think that just the sense of take your vitamins, do your, put the work in, um, work on your, I mean, I think in a modern context, it would be like, us trying to look at ourselves and, take time for yourself, and, get a therapist, or, exercise, or, do things for you, like have your own kind of self-care, and, embracing your own sense of self, that kind of exploration. Like that wasn't the way it was presented all the time, but I think that was kind of the mood, that the more we are willing to embrace and accept who we are, then we can work on being, the best version of that we can be. And that, I can get my head around that. And I think that what I was trying to say with the passage from Moses is, Jesus, God says, "I am who I am," meaning you are going to have to try to understand who I am, because what you understand me to be is who I am. But that understanding me will mean trying to understand yourself, which is a tall order for Moses. Again, because he had no idea really who he was at all. Moses, I mean, think through his life, how much time we're talking about. He finds himself born in Egypt, knowing of privilege, knowing that he was in a position that he should not have been in, that he was this Hebrew person raised by the Pharaoh, and didn't understand, would have spent most of his young life trying to just figure out, who on earth am I? Who am I being raised by? Why am I here? Why am I alive when all of these other children I know died, were killed, just for being born? And somehow I'm here. And then, has this encounter with an Egyptian and kills one and then flees. And the trauma of that. And you assume that after he flees, that maybe he never sees anyone that he cares about again. He goes into the countryside and gets married, and, works for the family, in the family business, basically, and becomes a shepherd for what we assume is another, 50 years, with a lot of time to think, and trying to reinvent himself, and trying to embrace who he was, and not be, think about that as your past. If that was your past, would you ever really escape it? And then after all of that time and all of that, he has this burning bush story. And God says, you're going to go and free Egypt. I can't even imagine what that would have been like for anyone. despite it being the person who was Hebrew, raised by Egyptians, and then asked to go and free his people, how ill-equipped could he have felt? It's like, I am the last person that any of them would want to listen to. I had a silver spoon in my mouth when all of them were slaves. I ran off after I killed one. Maybe I have a little bit of street cred, excuse the, colloquial phrase, because I killed an Egyptian, and maybe that makes me, good in the eyes of some Hebrew people. But I haven't done anything. I haven't done anything to deserve this task. So how do I even have any kind of credibility with them? And God says, tell them I am who I am. Meaning, I am the one that you know. But in order to know me, you have to also understand what that means, what identity means. And so Moses would then have to spend the next 40 years figuring that out, becoming the person who could speak to Pharaoh and go back there and speak defiantly and bring all of these plagues and these things, and then lead the people out, and then the dividing of the Red Sea, and be that person. And then we know all that happens to Moses afterwards, just all of the huge, incredible things that happen. And that until the day he dies is never quite at peace. And even at the end is there to get them to the door. Doesn't go into the promised land. He just gets them to the door. And that his whole life is this journey of discovery, of trying to redefine and reimagine what self means. What does it mean to be who you are? I am who I am. And that it reminds us that we aren't defined by any one thing, any one action, good or bad, but that we are defined by the love of God. That love is what compels us forward, that our accomplishments are not about, what we would put on a resume, or, our defining characteristic is not the worst thing that you've ever done, but our defining characteristic is being a child of the love of God. And that we know that good and bad will happen in the midst of all of that, but that we are always compelled to do everything we can in the moment, to take our spinach where we need to learn from our mistakes, to learn from the places where we have gone wrong, to be encouraged by the places that we have done right, to look at the situation around us and to do the best we can to make the world better because we're here. And that there's not some magic destination that we're trying to get to. We're trying to, every single day, whether we're in Egypt or in the wilderness or on Mount Sinai or down, wherever we are, that we are always in the midst of that. And so that all we can actually count on or be identified by is that love and how we can share it with other people. Because we can get really weighed down or bogged down by our past, or by the hope of some future that may or may not ever happen, that may never become real. All we really have is the moment that we're in. And if we can experience the love of God, then we will be who we are supposed to be. And I think that's basically the sermon. And there's a good chance that's what you're going to hear this evening if you join us for that. There will be some other elements that we're doing in the worship service itself, but that's essentially a lot of where we're going with the sermon part. All right, done with part 2. I've held you here long enough. I appreciate the fact that some of you were willing to do this. And if you heard both parts, there'll be you get double communion or something like that this Sunday. We'll give you the better bread or something as a treat. Anyway, thank you for doing this. Thanks for being who you are. Thanks for joining me on First Look, and we will see you next time. So take care.